All right, so it's the What Happened to Music podcast. We are taking another question from EdgeFed7. If you ever have a question, let us know on YouTube because we're always looking for material. So one of his questions is, and luckily we have DJ and Vince with us today. And let me get this exactly correct.
It's like we never left.
What are the hardest instruments to learn how to play? Now that's a pretty broad topic, and you can just define that in lots of different ways, but
so just to provide some background, all of us went to a music education program where we actually had to study any instruments you would find in a public school setting. Yep. So like your wind instruments, your strings, percussion. So we do have experience trying to learn these instruments.
Yeah, so I mean, all of us at least took a methods course on everything that you commonly see in a high school orchestra.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so DJ, initial thoughts, hardest instrument to play.
Well, when you're talking about the hardest instruments, you kind of think about like the ones that are less common, like probably bassoon or bass clarinet instruments like that. The hardest one that I had personally was bassoon, simply because it was just a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, we should probably point out DJ is a saxophone player. Vince is a saxophone player.
Yeah.
Joe is a saxophone player.
Diversity.
Yeah.
That actually has some background on bassoon.
Yeah,
and I'm just a stupid guitarist that decided to ruin your instrumental party.
Yep. Which I also want to say coincidentally was the only methods course that they didn't provide or was necessary.
They now do.
Now, is it mandatory?
It's not mandatory.
It's just for choice, though.
It's for choice.
They did have a guitar class, even though it wasn't really directed towards.
No, that was
music
for
educators.
That was for like, hey, rockers who want to strum.
Right.
Depends on your program.
So, I was very surprised that wasn't mandatory.
Yeah.
For just how big the guitar really is.
You got to take enough semesters of piano.
Well, that was easy.
All right, so you're going with bassoon. Why would you say bassoon?
I'm sorry?
Why would you go with bassoon? Why would you say bassoon?
Probably because it's just the fingerings are so just out there. It's just like, I'm a saxophone, so I hit a button and that's my note.
I believe it's known as keys.
Yeah, okay, that's true. But anyway.
Well, saxophone's very much.
I should just shoot myself.
Saxophone's very much.
He only knows guitar things, so like frets, strings, pluck, pluck.
But
that's all he knows.
But if you take a look at the fingering, I mean, it's pretty complicated. And you start adding the pancake key and all that other stuff. Even the fingering chart, you're looking at like, huh? It's like trying to put together like an IKEA furniture thing.
I was very lucky that Dr. Stewart during my bassoon final was fine with me. I had none of the fingerings correct, and he was like by his computer, and I was just lipping every single note. And he was like, it's sounding okay, because it just the bar was expected and what you could learn on bassoon in 7 weeks.
Yeah.
And then he asked me about the Renaissance lute, and then we had a grand old time.
It's just a difficult instrument to learn.
So I
think there's a reason why not a lot more people play.
Yeah. So bassoon, Vince, what are you going with?
It's odd. I didn't have that. Thinking of everything, I didn't have the most difficulty with bassoon. I actually thought it was like a little difficult, but if you practice it, it'd be fine. I actually had the most difficult with trumpet, even compared to French horn. I think that, and I do have some brass background. I played euphonium in high school and into college too with a small brass quartet, but the most difficult thing was trumpet. I don't know why. Maybe it's just like the imagery of just that very small, narrow mouthpiece compared to the French horn. But I just had the most. Ugh.
Joe has a good story about trumpet.
Tell me.
Well,
write it down.
So trumpet was probably the one I had most trouble with too, and that was the first instrument methods class I took right away, first thing at Rowan. I borrowed my dad's trumpet because he played, and he bought something, this is exactly what I was using when I stopped playing at the end of high school. So he obviously had been playing for a few years. Mm-hmm. And then I found out I had a lot of trouble in the class, even making a sound right up until the end. I found out later that apparently my mouthpiece from my dad's trumpet was way more shallow than what the school was loaning out to people for the beginner class. So there was a problem. That was not a beginner mouthpiece I was trying to buzz on and get a sound out of.
I remember it was when I first met you, and you're like, I'm failing trumpet. I'm like, oh, it can't be that bad. It can't, I'm just thinking you're being hard on yourself. And then I heard you try to play, and I went, oh, you can't.
And that's when you found out I'm a relatively honest person.
He's a relatively honest person about his skills. I know. I mean, it was awful.
But then I took it, and we had the instrument teaching methods, and then I borrowed a school trumpet, and I sat with that like, no, I'm going to get good at this, and then I was fine.
So I mean, that's a good point. Your equipment has to be in proper shape. And one nice thing about guitar is if you have a guitar that's of real poor quality, you can still kind of learn on it. I don't understand how kids have their parents come and get something off Craigslist for $60, and it's unplayable, unplayable.
Yeah, well, I'm just talking about my first horn. I mean, as a saxophone player, my first horn was a Bundy horn from Selmer. And I'm trying to play this thing and trying to get anything past like a low D was just impossible. And then finally I got a better horn. I'm like, oh, I'm not terrible. It's the horn.
And you think it's you. You think,
absolutely
I
did. You
I
get so
just can't
discouraged.
play this instrument.
Right.
See, it's very interesting. I used to work at a music store, Cole's Music, if you haven't heard of them. Go there. But it's amazing. But it was amazing that, I guess, like, I don't know if it's a generation thing. When we were younger, it was almost like maybe it was my fault. But now kids come in with these, like, purple clarinets or these, like, blue, just these random awkward colors
I like
they
the
buy
clear
off Craigslist.
recorders.
Yeah. And they say, like, oh, something's wrong with this horn. And we look at them like, well, you bought off Craigslist for at least $200 when you see a regular retail of it. And it's amazing that these kids are just, like, flabbergasted that, like, having these issues.
A lot of places won't service those instruments, right?
Yeah, that's the problem.
Some of them, it depends on it. If it's, like, really bad and you see, like, everything's just, like, barely put on together, then it's
like it's like an ethical thing of like, listen, I can nickel and dime you for the next servicing this instrument.
But we're even like, listen, like, it's probably better just to rent an instrument off us for cheaper, and it's like a Yamaha or a Jupiter or like a Selmer. Like, just take a quality one off us.
I have to say, renting instruments seems to be the better way to go. It's like, oh, here's especially
unless you buy something good.
Unless you really know that you're really going to go the.
But like just in the beginning, because then you at least take that like, oh, is it the instrument factor? It's like, well, no, it's not the instrument. It's it's your ability.
It's you.
Yeah.
So Joe, what would you say is the hardest instrument?
I would have to disagree on bassoon, and I could talk about that later. But
also, Joe's a very nice guy. We could probably talk openly about the story because I don't know if this person.
Yeah, we're jerks.
I hate.
I would say I would imagine clarinet would be hard for somebody not coming at it from a woodwind perspective.
Yeah.
It's a very tight embouchure. You got a very wide range. You got tons of different keys and buttons on there. Just thinking back to when I took the clarinet methods class and all the brass people, it was just how loud could they squeak because that's all they could do. Mm-hmm. And I could see that being extremely difficult to especially master with the wide range.
Well, I guess that's the point of, is this instruments for fourth graders to learn or instruments for adult beginners? Because that's
a fourth grader, I would say flute. Because you're going to try to get a
agree.
sound out of that. You're going to want to pass
100%.
out. You're going to cry.
That was actually maybe
100%.
possibly my worst method course because I didn't know how to like control the air. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, I'm just trying to put more air instead of controlling it, and then I would just get lightheaded and dizzy and then want to quit.
That's the one that people always seem to have problems with too, because all the other instruments have a mouthpiece that you're actually physically putting your mouth on.
Yeah.
Whereas a flute, you're hovering over it, and it's like sometimes things don't click instantly with the flute.
I have to say that I think that the hardest instrument is probably violin.
To play or to teach?
To play. The question of to teach, it's like, that depends on your skill set. Like, if you're a wind player, violin.
Yeah.
A violin, and I think you guys are definitely thinking more wind band, but a violin definitely has the issue of you're probably going to be getting a poor tone out of it initially, and you're probably going to be getting a poor tone out of it for quite a while. Well, and then you have the issue of constant intonation issues. It's
you
not
always
like
have to tune it too.
There's no frets.
There's no frets. The range can get insanely high. There's enough advanced techniques. There's enough people who are really good at it where the bar gets set really high. That's why if you think about piano is a relatively easy instrument as it stands, where it's like, I can go play an A and it's going to sound just as good as most other A's. And obviously it's what's expected of the instrument, the incredible demonstrations of sight reading, and but the instrument itself is easy. I think violin kind of laughs at you.
That was probably my second. It's that whole thing of what makes it so challenging is there are no frets, so it's really based off the ear. And when you're dealing with that, if your ear's just not up there, it's very difficult to get those positions.
Well,
Especially when it's screeching in your ear every time you're wrong.
It's the same issues that kids will have with trumpet.
Yeah.
Where it's not like, oh, hit a button. It's like, okay, well, you have to hit a button and also...
Here's a vague
yes,
demonstration
I know,
of what you need to do.
See, I'm totally
press a valve.
See, I'm totally different because I actually played violin in middle school and all through high school, so I did it for 8 years, and then I made a mistake of telling the teacher that I was a violin player, so I was the demonstrator for everything. But
Was this for high strings?
yeah, but I see it's a little bit different. I think it just take a look at each one of our backgrounds. Like, you know, we all had a different experience coming into it. Like, I obviously didn't have that hard of a time with violin because I did it. You probably had a little bit of difficulty because you're a wind player playing a brass instrument. Were you talking more about like from a student perspective, or did you actually have a hard time with clarinet?
I was talking from a student
Okay.
in general.
Because I actually had a hard time too with the break, but I think it really just depends on kind of where your mindset is and what you've done and what your background is, because you know, each one of us has our strengths, as you were saying earlier.
Yeah, and I think it was brought up earlier in terms of or the instruments that are played less frequently may be harder, but then you do also run into to cost issues.
Yeah.
Actually, in fact, we could just do
double read money.
We can actually probably just do a real quick podcast on cost issues.
Yeah.
So I mean I think that's why with things like bassoon,
I didn't think bassoon was that bad.
I didn't think so either.
My background with not to be a jerk.
Bloody
I mean, my background was I ended up taking about a year of private lessons on bassoon in college, and apparently I was good. That's what everybody's saying. I thought I was pretty mediocre, but I just none of the fingerings make sense. I looked at a fingering chart like half a year into it, and like I can't read this, and I know how to play the instrument.
Oh, that thing is awful.
Yeah,
like
that
it's just
fingering chart's
like
not
random
useful.
dots, and you're like, okay.
But once you get over the fact that it makes zero sense, then all my bad saxophone habits were good bassoon habits. So it was a good complementary double. It's true.
Wouldn't that be nice if you're negative qualities in your instrument?
If you play sax and you do bassoon too, that's a really good double.
And I will put in before we wrap up just one possible sort of check in the box, possibly for guitar as one of the most difficult instruments to learn, or certainly one of the most difficult instruments to master. Only because guitar, you could say, oh, you know, so and so plays guitar, and that can mean 10 different things to 10 different people.
Yeah. I feel like guitar's like one of those instruments that a lot of people think they can play, but whether they actually can play is up for debate. So it's like, you know, it's like kind of like piano too. Like, oh, I play piano, and then this is how I'm playing it.
But I think guitar initially to master is very difficult, but it's relatively easy to get going. So
there you go. Last thoughts.
I do agree with guitar. I totally forgot about that only because it wasn't one of our little classes that we had to do in college. But I do think that because you can think of anything with guitar. Like, I was like, oh, I play guitar, and it's like, oh, but I can read just chords or tabs, and it really depends on what the style you're playing and what it really means to master.